Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for that introduction. Excuse me. I will admit that I am not the most proficient at Blackboard, and one of the things that I'm learning about Blackboard in these kinds of sessions is that when I'm in presentation mode, I can't see any of you, and that puts me, I think, at a distinct advantage. I'm definitely someone who tends to try to watch the room to see how people are responding to what I am saying. So what I will say at the outset before I begin anything else is that number one, we have built in time for small group breakout conversations periodically over the course of the next hour and a half during this session. And so you are going to be pushed into small breakout rooms with some questions and then pushed back into the larger room for us to be able to engage a little bit in the larger group. If you have any questions about any of the ideas or the content that I'm presenting as I go along, please raise your hand or put those questions into the chat. I think Erica and a few other moderators are going to be pushing those questions to me. So I am someone who is happy to engage in that dialogue as I continue to go. Do not feel as if you have to hold all of your questions to the end. And then I will also be posing some questions to the larger group and be asking you to do some individual reflection and then sharing out with the larger group as we go. So if at any point there are any issues with you understanding what I'm saying or viewing the materials that I'm trying to present, please raise your hand and let me know, and I will do the best I can to make sure that I fix whatever the problem is. So in thinking about this work and this presentation today, I always like to take a step back, go beyond sort of the CV bullet points that you often get in these introductions, and tell you a little bit about how I got to here. And so you probably can hear from that introduction that I started out in a very traditional academic role. I was an assistant professor at a regional public university, four-year university, in the Wisconsin system in the area of human development. And I was fortunate enough to be in a place that very much valued teaching, very much valued our mission to serve the students that we have. And I had the opportunity to start participating in and developing programs and initiatives that supported the success of students. And the more I got engaged in that work and the more I got to work directly with students, the more I realized that one of the things that we need to do in higher education in order to really be able to support the success of all students is to start thinking about the work that we are doing in a much more what I call systems level perspective. My background in human development has taught me to think in a very contextual way using an ecological model, and I was always very interested in the ways in which the various systems that students are engaging in our higher education system are influencing their outcomes. And so as a result of those experiences with students, I started to get more involved in thinking about ways in which we can design systems of education for equity. And over the last 4 or 5 years, that work has really led me in a direction to think about the ways in which our systems of education, and in this case today we're going to talk about higher education, in some ways have been designed to marginalize students, and what we can do to really push back on that. So my goal for this morning is really to begin setting the foundation, honest conversations at Owens about the barriers to equitable outcomes that we face in all of our institutions of higher education today, and start an ongoing dialogue that you can engage in and think about actions that you can take to begin supporting your equity goals. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to talk a little bit more about that frame that I just presented, do a brief overview with you of some of the data that was presented at, I believe, the last Courageous Conversations presentation in the fall, which for me and maybe for you feels like a very long time ago right now. We're going to talk a little bit about the system, how we got to here. I'm going to share some very concrete best practices that people can engage in at every level of the educational system to support equity. And then we're going to spend a couple of minutes talking about where we can go from here. So one of the things that, and I'm not sure why my slides are looking a little strange here, but the frame that I take in this work is understanding that higher education is a public good. Those of us in higher education institutions that are public institutions, and in particular what I found, those of you working in community colleges, very much understand that this is the case, right? That aspirationally, our goal is to provide a public service to contribute to the well-being of society. From my work in the field of human development, I also know that education is one of the single greatest predictors of well-being. That is true of individual well-being. So individuals who have higher levels of education are healthier physically, they are healthier emotionally, psychologically. That is true for families. Families tend to be healthier when members of them have higher levels of education, and it's certainly true for communities and society. But I also know that higher education, although very importantly serves these individual and family and community functions for well-being, we know that it's also fundamental to building a more just and equitable society. And right now, that is something that is particularly important, I think, for many of us. And so when you look at, in context, what I've just said and the outcomes that our higher education system in this country achieves, there's a disconnect. If we know higher education is for the public, if we know it contributes to a just and equitable society, and that those who have higher levels of education do better in our world, when we look at data like this that shows the dramatic disparity in degree attainment for those on the left side of the chart, this is by socioeconomic status, where you are up to 4 times more likely to have a college degree by age 24 if you're coming from the upper 25 percentile of family income in this country, and you're only 11% likely to have a bachelor's degree by age 24 if you're coming from the lowest 25%. And we see persistence and pervasive gaps based upon race and ethnicity. And one of the things that I think is important for us to understand when we look at these data is that although the overall rate of degree attainment is increasing in this country, the equity gaps are not shrinking for either race and ethnicity or socioeconomic status at levels that in any way are significant. So these are very persistent gaps that we see, and we see them across type of institution, across level of higher education. So I want to pause and ask you to think about a few questions that are posed in one of my favorite books about education, higher education, Are You Smart Enough? By Alexander Aston. So in light of what we've just seen in these data, and in light of what we sort of know about the way higher education is set up, what does it say about our system of higher education when minoritized students of color who begin college are half as likely to graduate as their white peers? So not just whether they access college, but when a student of color attends college, they are half as likely to graduate as white students. What does it say about our system of higher education when the schools with the most privileged students have the highest level of resources, are the most well-resourced? What does it say about our system when the greatest mark of institutional quality in higher education is selectivity? In other words, who we don't let in. And what does it say about our system when we assign grades in our courses primarily by level of student knowledge and not by amount of growth or learning over the course of the term? So these are a lot of pretty heavy questions. What I'm going to ask you to do is to take a minute or two and just silently reflect, jot down some of your ideas, some of your responses to what it says about our system, that these things are the case. And then I'm going to ask for a few of you to share with the larger group. So a couple of minutes, and then we will come back and share out. Another 30 seconds, and then I'm going to ask for a couple of volunteers to share out their responses, unmute themselves.
Denise, it would, if folks could raise their hands and we could call them out.
That would be terrific, yes.
The hand raise is at the bottom of the screen, right under the slide numbers.
Yes. You're also welcome to share reflections in the chat box at any time. Okay, we have a first volunteer, Sabrina. Would you mind sharing?
Of course. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You know, I teach developmental English, and I have to remind myself regularly that all of us are only as good at the onset of taking on a new goal as what we've been taught to do during our upbringing. And so I really try hard when I have a student who seems to be exhibiting behaviors that are not conducive at all to the end game, to guide them in what needs to happen for them to get to their goals. And sometimes it works. You know, we assume that everybody understands that deadlines matter in school or that homework actually is significant. But we don't know where they came from, you know, what their parents' priorities were. And we have to remember that we don't come out of the womb knowing these things. So I am a friendly teacher. I hope that's my intention. So when I start to see students struggle, I don't do it in an audience situation. It's one-on-one. But a lot of times that really helps a student when I just sort of course, I can't tap them on the shoulder this semester, but that I approach them and say, you know, I'm noticing that you're not getting things done in a timely manner, and you're starting to slip back. I'd really like to share some ideas with you at how we might be able to remedy that. And sometimes it works, but I think what I'm trying to say here is we have to remember you don't know what students are coming to the table knowing what is appropriate. And it's okay to kindly take them under your wing and give them a little specific guidance about what works best. That's what I wanted to say.
Thank you, Sabrina. I think that's a really powerful point about learning and growth, right? And thinking in maybe more holistic ways about development and about what our students need to be successful. You know, you're absolutely right that we don't know where any of our students come from, what their backgrounds are like, what their prior educational experiences were. You know, in the question that I'm posing here, I think that one of the things that I'm kind of challenging you all to think about is that the system that we are within, some of these things we control, some of these things we have very little control over, are designed for particular outcomes. Right, and so this sort of one of the quotes that I spend a lot of time talking about because I think it's important for us to grapple with this is that our system is designed for the outcomes it's achieving. And you know, and we can look at our K-12 system and say, yes, this is true just as much with that system as it is with higher education. But you know, if our students are coming to us and they are underprepared, they are often underprepared because they're coming from schools that are under-resourced. And which schools are under-resourced? And which ones are better resourced? Regardless of what your family background is, right? And so, you know, in the first part of this presentation, what I'm going to try to get us to do is to think a little bit about the system that we are working within. And it's hard because these things are very implicit, and we often don't pay a lot of attention to them. We're kind of blind to them in many ways. And so we go about our days assuming, well, this is the way that it is, this is the way that it should be. without necessarily taking a step back and really thinking about what some of these things mean, right? So I'm gonna I'll ask I'm gonna pull out one of these questions and ask somebody to kind of reflect on this. What does it say about our system of higher education when the schools with the most privileged students have the most resources and the schools with the least privileged students have the least resources? Knowing nothing else, if you were an alien from another planet and you came here and you saw this, what would it say to you about our system? Joy. Joy, do you want to share? Okay, Joy, I'm not sure if you're still muted. We can't hear you.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Well, I think that this is so ironic because when you look at when public education began, you know, the people who began public education did it so that people with less resources who, you know, were left out by the system could be in the system and everybody be lifted up. Public education. That's the whole reason that we have public education, you know, so that everybody can have a place at the table. But it really, you know, it's so obvious that as usual, it's rigged in favor of the people who have the most privilege. It's like when people say that America should be, you know, a classless society, or that we should have a level playing field. It's like, well, we should, but we don't.
Right. And it's, you know, it's one of the, I think, most fascinating things about our society, right? That we hold this ideal of meritocracy, right? Of everybody has the capacity to be successful, of equality. And we fall short, you know, and we consistently fall short. And, you know, our public education system was designed to educate people who had not historically had access. But I think it's really important to note that most of our public education systems, both K-12 as well as higher ed, were not designed to educate students of color. They were designed to educate lower income white students. And it's important for us to recognize that if we are going to start dismantling the systems that perpetuate inequity, right, that are rigged, to use Joy's terminology. The only way that we do that is we start critically interrogating some of the ways in which we do education, right? And so asking questions like this, I think, is an important part of that work. So when I talk about these things, I use terms like equity and inequity, and I think it's really important for us to define what we mean by that. And sometimes one of the best ways to start is to think about what strikes us as equitable or inequitable. And so there are 4 scenarios here, and what I want you to do is to think about whether you think that these are equitable policies or practices. And specifically, I want you to think about that in terms of the 2 questions that are on the left of the slide. So who, by race or ethnicity, by socioeconomic status, or even by first-generation status, will benefit most from this policy or practice? And in what ways could this policy or practice disadvantage historically underserved students? So those are students who are minoritized students of color, lower socioeconomic status, first-generation students. So the first scenario, instructor Q is concerned that students aren't reading the required materials for class. So to help ensure they do so, she asked students at the end of the first week of class to line up and show the books to her at the end of class. Second scenario, the registrar's office requires that students provide written documentation from a doctor to support requests for late withdrawal. The third scenario, our finance office is concerned about the increasing number of students who are not paying their tuition on time. doubles our late fee from $50 to $100. And then 4, our nursing program, concerned that they have too many applicants relative to number of spaces they have in each cohort, increases their ACT score requirement for admission to their program. So what I want you to do again is to go back into sort of silent reflection. And for each of these 4 scenarios, I want you to not answer whether you think they're equitable or inequitable. I want you to answer the 2 questions on the left. Who's going to benefit most? And who might this policy or practice disadvantage? So spend a couple of minutes jotting down your responses, and then we're going to ask you to put them in the chat and to also share by raising your hand. 2 minutes again, silent reflection. Okay, 30 seconds to finish up your thoughts, and then I'm going to ask for some sharing. Okay, so let's talk about number 1. This is an example from my institution, something that, excuse me, happened last year. So what do we think? Who benefits most from a policy where the instructor asks students to line up with their textbooks at the end of class to make sure that they have them? And in what ways could this policy or practice disadvantage historically underserved students? Feel free to share in the chat or raise your hand if you would like to talk. We have nobody raising their hand, and we have nobody putting anything in the chat. Is that because we are all clear that on this one we don't have any, no gray area? Is this equitable or inequitable? What do you think? Okay, so I have a few votes for inequitable. Right. Corey is saying it stigmatizes students that have to wait for financial help or can't afford the book. Yep. Yes. And of course, this instructor did not think that that's what they were doing. They were trying to figure out a way to incentivize students to bring their textbooks to class and to use their textbooks. But it absolutely can be humiliating for students. So what is likely to happen if a student does not have the book? They're likely to leave that class and potentially never come back. Right. So what about number 2? Registrar's office requires written documentation from a doctor to support requests for late withdrawal. In what ways could this policy or practice disadvantage historically underserved students? This is something that's quite common in most colleges and universities. Right, not everybody can afford to see a doctor. They cost money. It assumes that there's a relationship with the doctor, right? So those who have relationships with doctors who can just do a quick call to the office, get them to email something. Yes. It is insurance because this often costs money. Right. So there are a lot of ways in which what feels like a reasonable policy can really disadvantage historically underserved. And then, 3 and 4, different iterations of the same kinds of questions, right? We often enact these policies or practices thinking that they're going to support our goals without taking a step back and thinking about who is going to benefit most from this and who is going to be disadvantaged. Denise.
So we deal with some of these all the time, and often the response I hear, not necessarily from faculty, but from those who make policy is, well, it's fair to everyone because we're treating everybody the same. How would you tackle that type of response?
Well, we are not treating everyone the same, right? That the society and our system does not treat everyone the same. The fact that some of our students have access to doctors and some of them don't. The fact that some of them have money to pay for their textbooks and some of them don't. So what I tend to do is I increase the frame of reference because, again, going back to context, you can't just look at one policy or one practice divorced from the reality of the system it lives within. And, and I actually have in a couple of slides this that sort of textbook graphic about what equity is versus equality that I think is problematic, and I'm going to kind of share what I think is a better graphic that may help people to understand that they need to be thinking in a more systems level way about the impact of these policies or practices. Does that answer your question, Denise?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah. So really nice foreshadowing too. How many of you have seen this sort of very common graphic representation of the difference between equity and equality? We've all kind of seen Yes. Okay. So a lot of people have seen this, right? And very commonly we define equity as having equal access to an opportunity to succeed in college. And in and of itself, this definition does help to address some of what Denise was talking about, that, you know, it isn't about being quote unquote equal to every student. It's about making sure that every student has an equal opportunity to be successful. And often we talk about that as ensuring that every student has what they need to be successful, and that different students might need different things, right? So on the right side of this chart, you see the typical representation of equity that shows that the shorter student needs more boxes to be able to reach the bell. The problem with this representation is that, it assumes that the shorter student just happens to be the shorter student for, by no fault of our own, right? It just is the way that they are. But the reality is that that is not how our world is. Yes, it's a baseball game graphic. Somebody else beat me to the punch, right? So here's what really happens, right? When we're looking at what it means to be equitable, that, in reality, the fence is not the same height for every student. And that, if we provide quote unquote equal opportunity, the same size box for every student, the student who's on the left, who's got the short fence, is going to have a much easier time of it. The student on the right is not. But the student on the right is facing circumstances that make it much more difficult for them to be able to see over the fence. And so what I have come to is a definition of equity that privileges a dismantling of the fence, of the structures, the practices, and the policies that create these barriers. It's not just about putting some boxes up to sort of level the playing field. It's about understanding our role in creating, in building the fence that disadvantages some students and privileges other students. So I'm going to pause there and ask for reactions to this. You can put in the chat or you can raise your hand. Does this resonate with you? The first time you've seen this, or if you've seen it before? Okay. Yes, and I'm looking in the chat, and why not make the fence transparent, right? So that everyone can access the game. Yes, transparency is one of the most important things that we can do to dismantle the system of privilege that we have in education. I encourage you, if you are going to talk about issues of equity, to use this kind of a graphic as opposed to that more typical one, and to make it very clear that we're the fence, right? And that, we are creating a system that is making it harder for some students to be successful. And so then just creating some structures to help them succeed is not enough. And yeah, it is one of the constant challenges and duties that as educators we face. And you're right, particularly in the community colleges, because you all are the front line of this work. So I'm going to really briefly review the data that was presented to you at your Fall Courageous Conversations event, just to put some of this in local context. So very, very quickly, you know that your population sort of roughly mirrors the population of Lucas and of Lucas County, that you are slightly overrepresentative of white students. We know that when you look at your year 1 to year 2 retention, that minoritized students of color are being retained at significantly lower rates than white students, rates of over 18 percentage point gaps, right? And so your white students are 18 percentage points more likely to come back year 2 than your minoritized students of color. We see similar trends for your lower income students, an over 20 percentage point gap in year 1 retention. When we look at your credit attainment in the first semester, we also see sizable gaps. So your minoritized students of color earn 21.6% fewer credits in the first term than your white students do. And again, you see a similar gap for lower income students where they are earning 17.7% fewer credits in the first term as compared to higher income students. And then when you look at your 3-year graduation rates, the gaps for graduation very much accurately reflect gaps that you are seeing for retention in the first year. And you are seeing a slight increase, and I don't know how long-term this trend is, in the size of the gap, right? And so the gap for your 2016 cohort was 20%, and it was only 17% for your 2015 cohort. So at the very least, you are maintaining a relatively sizable gap in graduation rates. And I think it's important to note that the gaps that you are experiencing are very consistent with what we see in most colleges and universities, particularly public regionals and community colleges across the country, that it is not unique to Owens to see these kinds of gaps. But I think it's really important for us to think about what those gaps mean for us at our institutions. So we are going to go into our first official breakout session now. We're going to do 5 minutes in small group discussion and then come back to the large group for some sharing out. And in that small group discussion, I would like for you to talk about these 2 questions. Right? What conclusions can we draw about the goals of our system, right? And this is localized, so we're talking about Owens, from the outcomes that you're achieving. And how does it feel to know that our practices are disadvantaging racially and economically minoritized students? So that second question is meant to provoke a certain amount of discomfort, because in order for us to do this work, we have to start sitting with the discomfort of knowing that practices, whether they're intentional or not, that we are engaging in are contributing to the problems that we see. So we're going to push you out in small groups, and at about 48 or so, we are going to pull you back into the large group for a little bit of a share out. And across my I hope this works.
The questions were just posted in the chat. So if you want to copy and paste them to take with you to the breakout room, feel free to do that. And we'll also have moderators go into the breakout rooms to make sure you have the questions.
Hi, moderators.
Hello.
Hi. Hi. So,
All right, so what do y'all think so far? I think the audience, and I don't know what to take from the fact that they're not being quite as willing to talk in a large group. Should I be concerned about that?
Denise, it's going very well.
I'm sorry, Erica. I'm having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. Some background noise, I think.
There we go. I said it's going very well.
Okay.
And you're getting more comfortable with not seeing people.
I'm getting, it's still very strange. Not my comfort zone. It is an odd thing to just talk at a screen and not see anyone.
You can't tell.
Okay, well, that's good. I'm going to try to remember when we and to stop sharing my screen. I'm a little worried about the time involved in unsharing and resharing to be able to see people, but I don't know if that is enough of a concern.
We'll keep you on track.
Okay.
And it looks like Jen is moving some of us into groups right now to make sure that everybody has the questions.
Great.
Not gonna lie, the sociologist in me loves to watch the people that will leave as soon as they have to be in small groups.
Even virtually, I know.
I find it
Oh, no.
fascinating.
I'm out.
I find it
God,
fascinating.
force me to talk to other people. I'll be back in 5 minutes. Yeah. It's harder to leave when you're in an actual room during the small group breakout.
I won't lie, I'm one of those people that would do it, so.
Yeah, no, I get it. I mean, I'm an introvert, so talking to strangers in a small group about like difficult and sensitive issues is not my comfort zone at all. But I also know all the research on how much it helps, right? You need to do it because it is how we process. And especially if you're trying to think about building coalitions of people who understand this and trying to do this work on your campuses, that they have to talk to each other about these things. Sort of the first step. So I get the discomfort, but I also know the importance of doing it anyway.
Hey, Erica, this is Corey. Can I just ask quickly? I don't know if I should be navigating to different groups right now or.
Well, I thought that Jen said that she was going to put us in groups.
Oh, okay, so she'll tell us where to go.
Well,
Awesome.
I've moved people, but it looks like people have moved out of where I moved them.
Oh, weird.
Yeah. Which
So
is
they're going
weird.
into other rooms?
I would have also done that.
So like, I just moved Amber, but like when I move Amber, she moves out. Like, Corey, I'm moving you now.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Okay, I just wanted to make sure that they had the question.
It will be good for them to be on their own.
Just remember that when you go in, you won't see the previous chat, so you don't know if they've already posted that question, so you may be repeating it as well.
Okay. Thanks, Gary.
So we're not moderating their discussion, just making sure they have the questions.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and see, here you are again. Corey, I just moved you, and now you're back.
Oh, yeah,
Why
I
are
never felt like I left.
Hey,
That's
I
really
just
odd.
saw,
Kenzie is saying in
It's
the group
probably
chat
because
that
other people are moving other people at the same time. That's why it's getting messed up like that.
Okay.
Either that or because we have the power to move ourselves, Jen. Maybe that's why I haven't moved.
No, it's probably because the minute Jen pushes the button, somebody else clicks to move, and it moves people back to the main, because she's moving somebody differently than you are. So when you click update, it puts that person back in the main room that she just moved into the other chat room.
Got it. So, Gary, do you suggest when we set the groups the next time to
One
actually
person, yes.
leave the moderators in there?
Well, so it looks like,
Okay.
Did we pick out a number of rooms here? Or did it automatically create 10 groups?
I told it to randomize 10 groups.
Okay, so I think maybe we all pick a group or two next time, and then we can all move ourselves into the respective groups, or one person moves everybody.
Okay.
There is a chat from Kenzie that says, when you moved me to the other room, it disconnected me. So I don't know if she's in a room or just hanging out somewhere.
Yeah, there's two in the main room.
We do have a couple of participants, it looks like, here in the main room.
It's probably about time to pull them back, too. I think we've had 5 minutes.
Yep, I was just about to say, time's up.
Okay. I will pull everyone back, and next time what I'll do is I'll randomize it and include the moderators, because the moderators can still jump around if they want to.
Thank you, Jen.
You're welcome. Okay, I'm bringing everyone back, Denise.
Class. Do not that's
Oh, you're gone.
to do something. Might. Oh well, never mind. Done.
Okay, are we back?
Yes.
That was very interesting. I got moved into group 3 for 30 seconds. For some reason.
Group 3 is where it's at. Hey, group 3.
It was a cool group, but I have no idea why that happened. I'm glad I'm back.
Oh my.
Okay, do we have everyone back?
You sure do. Everybody's back.
Okay, so I'm going.
Ask people to themselves real quick.
I'm sorry, Erica?
We'll just ask folks to mute themselves.
Oh, yes, please do. And I think that in the interest of time, I'm going to ask you for this one to very quickly put in the chat 1 or 2 words that reflect how you feel to know that our practices are disadvantaging racially and economically minoritized students. Just 1 or 2 words that reflects what you were talking about, how you were feeling. Okay. We've got helpless, blind spot, sad, frustrating, guilty, sad, frustrated, disheartened, hurt, ashamed, sad and ashamed, disheartened. Right. And then wanting to know how to fix it. Right. Unpredictable, overwhelmed, upset. Yeah. These are really difficult realities to face. And, I'm certainly not somebody who is going to promote shame as a motivator. However, I think that it is important for us to feel angry and frustrated and hurt and disappointed and maybe angry, because that does help us to motivate us to start thinking about these things at a more system level. But I don't want us to feel defeated or overwhelmed. I mean, one of the things that we're going to start talking about in a few minutes is, the good news is that there are some fairly simple, straightforward things we can do in our classes and in our communications with students that can start moving the needle on these things immediately, as we are also doing the heavier lift work of thinking about our policies and our practices and rethinking our system. So we will get into that. And so rhetorically, the question that I want you to keep in mind as we move into this next section is, how would we need to change to design a system that actually led to equity of outcomes? So this is rhetorical for now, and we will revisit that question in a little while. So from my read on this, in order to really achieve equity, we have to take a systems level approach. We have to look at our practices. We have to look at our policies. And many of us have spent a lot of time over the last few months reading the work of Ibram Kendi. And in the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, he presents what was, I think, 6 months ago, a somewhat controversial perspective on this that I think has become, importantly, less controversial. And what he says is that the opposite of racist is not racist. It's anti-racist. And that things are either one or the other. Things are either racist or anti-racist. There's no neutral middle ground. There's no safe space of not racist. And so you either believe that the problem is people, right? Racist people who have racist attitudes, in which case we're never really going to affect real change. Or you understand that the root of the problem is in our power structure and in the policies that are created to maintain that power. And when you understand that, you're an anti-racist. So you either allow racial inequities to persevere as a racist, or you confront them as an anti-racist. There's no neutral space. This is a confrontational perspective, but I think it's really important for us to start thinking in this way, because in what we do every day, there is an opportunity to be anti-racist. But when we're not doing that, it's important for us to understand that what that means is that we are perpetuating the racist system. We are perpetuating the inequity through our inaction. So what does it mean? What are the principles that underlie a systems level approach to anti-racist, equity-focused education? One of the other influential books that I've read recently on this was written by Stella Ben-Simone, Tia Brown McNair, and Lindsay Malcolm Foucault, and it's called From Equity Talk to Equity Walk, right? It's about walking the walk of this. And what they say is that equity is a means of corrective justice for the educational debt owed to the descendants of enslaved people and other minoritized populations who have been intentionally excluded from higher education. That equity is also an anti-racist project to confront overt and covert racism embedded in our structures, policies, and practices. And equity lets us see whiteness as a norm that operates unperceived through our structures, policies, and practices, and that racialize the culture and outcomes of higher ed institutions. All three of these are uncomfortable for many of us to address. To think about equity as corrective justice, that we have done such violence to marginalized people that we need to approach education in this way, that we need to be actively anti-racist, and that we need to understand that whiteness infuses everything that we do in the system of education, mostly implicitly. The conditions that they say need to be met in a higher education to truly achieve equity is that we have to walk the walk. There must be institutional accountability for the achievement of, in particular, racial parity in student outcomes. One of the things that this book says that I think is particularly important is that over the last 5 or 10 years, we have become increasingly comfortable using the language of equity. But one of the things that has unintentionally happened as a consequence of that is that it has allowed us to ignore the discomfort that is created by acknowledging the racist disparities in particular. And so they really call us to focus on race and racial parity because it is different. Racism is different from the other isms in our society, and we need to acknowledge that. And that can look like focusing on what we call the raw equity gap numbers in your strategic goals. So instead of trying to handicap yourself by saying, well, if a student comes in with a high school GPA of this, then they're only 3% less likely to graduate if they're African American than if, than if they're white. No, you need to take responsibility for your part in this system and say that regardless of their high school GPA, our goal is that every student graduates. We need to be thinking about this in the way that we build accountability structures for tenure and promotion of instructors, for program level work, for college level work. In every level of the system, this needs to be there. And we also need to really accept the omnipotence of whiteness at all levels of our system. And of course, this is things like looking around at who is at the table in positions of leadership, who advances and who doesn't. But it also is looking at things like bereavement policies that might be limited to quote unquote immediate family members defined as parents, spouses, or children. Or even the expectation that all students have a private space in which to participate in online synchronous classes, when the reality is the lived experience of many of our students, particularly for non-white students, does not necessarily allow for that. And again, these are all fairly uncomfortable for us to address. But here's kind of the good news. To effect real change, we should be focusing on policies and practices, not people. It's not about calling people racist. It's about looking at the policies and practices that are perpetuating racist outcomes. We also need to start focusing on impact, not intent. It doesn't really matter whether you intended to discriminate against certain groups of people. Although I would say that although it might not have been our intent, and honestly, I think that in many ways that's arguable when you look at the systems of education that we've created, it's certainly not the case that we couldn't have anticipated these outcomes. We know the outcomes that we are achieving, but we need to focus on the impact, the outcomes, not the intent. And then we need to use our data and evidence-based practice to combat the racist systems that exist. So what does that look like if you are in the classroom? I'm going to walk through fairly quickly some ways that you can use tools in your classes that will promote equity of outcomes. The first thing that I'm going to recommend that you do is to go back and critically interrogate your data in your classes. Look at your DFW rates, disaggregate them by race and ethnicity, by socioeconomic status. Examine the grades that you're getting on individual assignments. Who completes what? Who's doing well on quizzes versus homework versus class activities? One of the things that one of my instructors found recently, DFW are rates of D's or F's earned in your classes or withdrawals, right? So it is a common metric that we use to examine equity in class outcomes. Thank you, Denise, for asking for that clarification. So one of my instructors found that some of her students were earning lower grades on homeworks that were completed over the weekend as compared to the ones during the week, and that those tended to be students of color. And when this instructor asked the students to talk about some of the issues and the challenges that they were facing over the spring term in doing this work, the students talked about not having a quiet space to complete work at home. So when you disaggregate your data in these kinds of very unique ways, you can see some patterns emerge that you wouldn't necessarily be able to see if you weren't focusing on levels of success within individual assignments. One of the most powerful things that you can do is intentionally try to build a sense of community and belonging in your class. And so when I do this work, I use Terrell Strayhorn's definition of belonging. It's the experience of mattering or feeling cared about, respected, and valued by, and important to campus, the specific people on campus, your instructors, your peers. The reason why this is so critically important is that belonging is a basic human need, right? If you look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, if students do not feel as if they belong in college or belong in your classroom, they are not going to be as successful, regardless of what you want to consider to be their aptitude, their background, their motivation. That belonging is a really key motivator of human behavior. One of the most simple things that instructors can do to support belonging is to send a welcome letter to your students before class begins and convey your excitement about engaging in this work with them, some personal information about yourself. Now I'm encouraging instructors to also acknowledge current circumstances and talk about the ways in which you're working to design a course experience that is going to be high quality and engaging, but also flexible given the current circumstances, and recognizing that you understand those challenges. What we know is that when instructors do this kind of relatively easy work, students report feeling less belonging, uncertainty in the class, and they feel as if their instructor is more concerned about them. Something else that I am encouraging all of my instructors to do this year is to include a note about recent events, the pandemic, and also the pervasive struggle to deal with the consequences of racial violence in this country. So this is a statement we drafted for the University of Toledo that is based upon recommendations from the Student Experience Project, which is a grant-funded project that we are working on. And I encourage you to really think about including in some way these kinds of messages, whether in your syllabus, your welcome letter, or even your conversation with your students. Another thing that many instructors have started to do is include basic needs statements in your syllabus. This came out of the work of Sarah Goldrick-Robb in the HOPE project. We know that many of our students are struggling to meet their basic needs, and when you normalize that experience for students who are struggling, they are much more likely to reach out for help and to feel as if this is a campus that understands them and at which they belong. And the last thing that I'm going to encourage you to do to focus on and support belonging in your classroom is to share your stories about belonging. And what I mean by this is share your stories about times which you felt you did not belong, particularly in an academic setting. And in key to doing this, you want to assure students that that kind of challenging concerns about belonging are normative, that many students face. They don't signal a lack of academic potential or that you don't belong in college, and that it generally gets better over time, and there are steps you can take to help improve your feelings of belonging at the institution. So in the slides that I have here, we're going to go into a breakout session. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is in this breakout session to share with your group members a quick story about a time where you were uncertain whether you belonged in an academic setting, to talk about what made you feel that way and how feelings changed over time. So back in the small group for a few minutes to share those stories, and then we will come back and process.
Okay, moderators, I didn't move you this time. If you want to pop in groups, I think that will work out better. I'm not going to move you because as you're moving, then we kind of got lost. So
yeah, no, that's fine. I think I will stay here just so that I can
okay.
kind of prep for.
We'll go into group 10.
I can take group 1.
I'll go into group 2.
I'll do group 9.
Hey, Jennifer, how do I move myself?
Go to attendee controls,
Yep.
which is where you see your name in the group under the little arrow, and you'll see moderators, and then it'll say move to another group.
I'll go to group 8.
Awesome.
Erica, are you still in this room? Or JJ? I am running a little bit behind on time, and I can certainly sort of cut some of the content, but I wanted to get a sense of you about when you think my end point should be in terms of how much time should we provide for the broader Q&A given the work that we're doing in between.
I think first down at 10:10. We should be able to have a little bit of dialogue if there's any left, because it looks like there's some dialogue that's happening in the chat amongst folks, and then the interaction that we're having is working out fine. So
okay, sorry, Erica, you cut out. I only heard like one of every 4 words you said there. So what time do you think we should open to Q&A?
I think 10 till.
Oh, okay. Okay. So you think that we're accomplishing enough of the discussion in this work? We don't need.
There's some conversation that's happening in the chat amongst people. like outside. And you're probably trying to keep up with it, but still trying to facilitate. But people are having their own conversation.
Great.
So it's good.
Yeah, no, I am kind of monitoring the chat to the extent that I can. There's some really good stuff going on in there.
Yes. So yeah, I think it's good. I got my timer going so that we can make sure that pulling them back. So yeah, it is. It's going very well. This is good info.
Good. I'm glad.
Julie, I couldn't either, so don't feel bad. You don't have to move me, Hazel. I think that all the rooms were covered. Thank you. Hazel, it looks like Posey wants to go to 5. That might have been one that didn't get touched.
I'll get her in 5 here.
I think we're probably, are we just
Are you
about,
almost ready though, Denise?
yeah, I think we're at 5 minutes.
Okay. We'll get this down by the last breakout group.
Hey, it's doing so much better than the last time I tried this, and I literally had, associate deans who were sort of lost in a weird purgatory in Microsoft Teams and couldn't find their way back into rooms, and so this is working well, I think.
Actually, I would say this too from my perspective of how many people are participating. Amazing. And people are really having some great stuff to say. So even if the groups were a little wonky, it's great. They're still like into it.
Good. That's so, yeah, gosh, I wish we were doing this face to face.
I know, because it would be like booming, you know what I mean? Like, because like the chat, I'm like having a hard time keeping up with reading everything everyone's saying in the chat.
Wow. Okay. Cool.
Jen, go ahead and bring them back.
All right, I'll bring everyone back.
Okay.
All right, welcome back, everybody. Please mute yourself as you're coming back into the main room. All right. Let's see. There we go. Welcome back, everybody. I hope that you had some really interesting conversation about your belonging stories. And I'm going to ask for maybe one person who is willing to share their brief belonging story about a time where they felt like they were uncertain whether they belonged in an academic setting and what made them feel that way. Is anybody willing to raise their hand and share? Okay, Sabrina, you volunteered, so I will really accept.
Okay. Graduate school had its moments of being a very humbling experience. And there were always, or more often than not, those students that by design would communicate in a very convoluted, hoity-toity manner to make themselves look superior. And I found that very off-putting and frustrating because I'm more of a, I'm smart enough, but I like to communicate clearly for the general public. And so I always felt like pressure to try to say things at a much higher level than were necessary. And sometimes I could pull it off. And other times I just, it wasn't me. But I didn't like that. That feeling like you're expecting someone to stand up and point to you and say, you don't belong here. It's a terrible feeling. But I think that it was more about those students that wanted to pump themselves up that was about them, not about my capabilities. But you don't always feel that way day to day.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, one of the things that we all do when we feel insecure is that we use the existing levers of power to make ourselves feel powerful. But I think thank you for sharing that, Sabrina. I think that's a really common story that many of us feel. And the parts of that often feel so uncomfortable to us is that it calls us to question whether we belong because we're not using the same language somebody else is using, and that we often are worried that other people are going to judge us as not belonging because we don't sound the same or look the same or have the same background or have the same educational experiences. And the reason that I ask when I do these workshops, you all to share these stories with each other is because when you think about the times in which you were uncertain about whether you belonged in an academic setting, it really helps you to build empathy for what your students might be feeling and to be open to thinking about, the ways in which that belonging uncertainty may be influencing their behavior and, stopping before you make judgments about why they're acting as if they don't care about turning in assignments or how they're doing in your classes. It could be belonging uncertainty. It may not be that they don't care. In fact, in my experience, it is almost never that they don't care, because if they didn't care, they wouldn't be there, right? It is a way for them to try to maintain a sense of control over a situation where they're worried they don't belong. So in the interest of time, there are some more tips in the next couple of slides about how you can promote a sense of belonging in the classroom. I'm not going to go over them, but you all will have access to a PDF that includes all of these slides. And so you will be able to read through them, and there's enough text in here that you can get the gist of what I was trying to say. But I want to make sure that I at least hit upon the other classroom tips that I think are really important for us in designing educational systems for equity. And so earlier on in the presentation, one of the participants referenced the importance of transparency, right? Being clear. This is an incredibly important tool for equity in education. Be transparent about your expectations for students, about the expectations for students at your college. Transparency builds navigational capital. Navigational capital is the knowledge, the skills, the habits of mind that are required to effectively navigate any complex system, including the complex culture of college. And make no mistake, college has its own culture. And many of us who have been in it for decades don't see culture, right? Culture is invisible to many of us. But college and the system of college, the culture of college, privileges students whose backgrounds align with those who designed the system, white, Western, middle and upper class, often male, in many different ways. And so students whose backgrounds don't have significant experience with the culture of college really benefit from those of us who can act as cultural navigators. And being transparent is a critically important way to build navigational capital. So there are some tips here for what you can do. A lot of them are what they sound like. Be transparent. Explain, particularly in this climate as we're moving in very different kinds of modalities for our courses, exactly what the expectations are for students' engagement in your courses, synchronously or not, walking them through any technology that you are asking them to use, and pay particular attention to this in your first year courses and in your gateway courses where students are least likely to have the navigational capital here. There's some information here on how you can assess the transparency of your assignments, being very, very clear about what you're asking students to do, why you're asking them to do it, and how they are going to be evaluated. I cannot overemphasize how important a consistent schedule is for students, particularly now as they are learning under significant amounts of stress, that we need to be human first in the way that we approach our students and understand that stress affects memory. So you may tell students that something is due on Wednesday and they may not remember. And so the human thing to do, the empathetic thing to do is to provide reminders and routine schedules that make it easier for them to stay on task. Probably many of you have thought about the kinds of feedback that you give to students. But when you think about feedback as a tool for equity, it's really important that you think about providing students with a lot of low-stakes feedback that provides them with actionable information that they can use to improve their performance over time. My favorite model of this is the WISE feedback model. And there are 4 components. So the first is that you have to give honest description of the student's performance. You cannot tell them that truly mediocre work is of high quality. Because here's the thing, a lot of times students sort of recognize that their work is somewhat mediocre, and if you tell them that it's excellent, one of the things that may happen is they may worry that the reason you're saying that is you don't believe that they are capable of doing better. So you need to give honest feedback, but you need to couple that with a statement about the fact that you understand that you have high standards for students' performance and for their performance in particular, and that's why you're giving them this honest feedback. And that you are doing it because you know they have the capacity to be successful in the class and to achieve these standards. And then finally, you give them specific actionable suggestions for improvement. What we have found is that when instructors give this kind of feedback, it lowers equity gaps in courses, and it improves outcomes overall. And it increases student motivation, even when they get a C. Even when you're giving highly critical feedback, using this model improves success and motivation and reduces equity gaps. One of the most interesting things that I have learned about growth mindset, so those of you who spend time thinking about education and talking about education, you've probably heard the term growth mindset before. Very often we are talking about that in the context of trying to cultivate a growth mindset in your students, that if they believe that they have the capacity to grow and learn and improve, then they are going to do better in your classes. Absolutely true. However, one of the things that I have recently learned is that it is equally, if not more important, for us as instructors, as administrators, as staff members, to have a growth mindset about our students. Why? Here's why. There's a really good study done in 2019 that looked at the extent to which instructors have a fixed or growth mindset about students' capacity. Fixed mindset is defined as the belief that students' capacities are fixed, are static, that students are either going to be able to be successful in your class or not. A growth mindset is the belief that students can improve with effort, that intelligence can be developed. And what the study found is that when an instructor had a more fixed mindset about students' capacities to succeed, the overall course grades are lower, the racial achievement gap in the class doubles. So let me say that again. When an instructor has a fixed mindset about intelligence, the racial equity gap in their class doubles. And students report more negative experiences in that class, more negative impact of the instructor on student learning, and lower motivation to succeed. In fact, instructor mindset was a stronger predictor of student achievement in these classes, and this was a large-scale study of hundreds of classes and thousands of students. Instructor mindset was a stronger predictor of student outcome than the level of teaching experience, the tenure status of the instructor, the age, the gender, or the race and ethnicity of the instructor. Excuse me. So what we believe about our students' capacities for success profoundly influences their outcomes. And we know this because this is a typical representation of disaggregated DFW rates for intro-level courses at any college or university around this country. We know that the DFW rates, the rates of D's and F's and withdrawals, are significantly higher for minoritized students of color and significantly higher for Pell students. across almost every class that you look at. But what this tells us is what we can do to start changing that. We need to change our mindset about students and about capacities. And there are different ways that you can do this. There are ways that you can communicate to students that you have a growth mindset in their abilities by challenging their fixed mindsets when you hear them. That when students struggle, frame the conversation with them about strategies for improvement rather than their static attributes or abilities. And structure your assessments in ways that allow you to see their improvement and students to see their own improvement. So we're going to here, and I think that in the interest of time, I'm going to say, let's not do this as a breakout. Let's just do this as a individual side kind of reflection. It is not easy to think about ways to challenge your own mindset about students and to build your growth mindset about students. So what I want you to do is to take a minute or two and to identify a concrete behavior that you're going to engage in to build your growth mindset about your students and about their capacities. And so this could be something like, I'm going to grade my students' papers blind, so I don't know who they are. And then I'm going to look at their performance on that paper relative to the previous paper to see evidence of growth. Or I'm going to highlight and remember times when students exceeded my expectations for them. Or I'm going to educate myself on implicit bias and the ways in which it influences the ways that I engage with my students. So take a minute or two and think about what you might do to build your growth mindset about students, and then we will share. I'm going to give you another 30 seconds to think, and then I'm going to ask you to just share the sort of bulleted behavior that you're going to engage in the chat function so we can all see your ideas for a concrete behavior that you're going to engage in to build your growth mindset about your students. Okay, so what are we seeing? Sharing our stories. What other concrete behaviors are you going to engage in to build your growth mindset about your students? Right. Frame conversations about strategies for improvement with your students. And we know that the behaviors we engage in influence our beliefs. So if we're talking with students from the perspective that we believe in their capacity to be successful, we're going to improve our belief that they are capable of success. Create a strategic plan for addressing statements like, I'm just not good at this. Yeah. How many times do we get that in our classes? I'm not good at math. I can't do this kind of reading. I'm not good on these sorts of tests. Absolutely. So I challenge you to really think about ways that you can challenge yourself to get past the fixed mindset that unfortunately our system of education really instills in us about capacity. There are some, I think, really helpful ideas for ways that you can examine your course from messages about the value of students' racial and ethnic or socioeconomic backgrounds, again, from the Equity Talk to Equity Walk book. So I encourage you, again, when you look at the PowerPoint presentation, to review these, think about how they might help you to create a more racially just course for your students. I want to turn now to thinking at a little bit of a higher level about institutional ways to support equity. And so one of the things that we all can do within our institution is to think about the ways in which whiteness and socioeconomic privilege are pervasive conditions that determine our policies and practices. And we've talked about this morning, and we can think about this in terms of our admissions criteria for particular programs, our faculty and staff hiring, tenure, and promotion. One of the more interesting ideas that I've heard recently about this, about how do you hire faculty candidates who are going to allow you to design a more equitable system, is ask your faculty candidates to demonstrate how they would explain their syllabi on the first day of class. And look for cues about whether they're going to discuss it as a contractual document, or those who are going to use it as an opportunity to build belonging and connection, reduce belonging uncertainty, reduce fears about topics, let's say, like math. And then you also can think about your institutional core values and mission. I think it's important for us to interrogate the ways in which those core values and missions in and of themselves have infused in them assumptions of whiteness and socioeconomic status. Something else that I think we all need to do is really shift the focus away from us, or excuse me, shift the focus to us and away from our students as the cause of the problem. And one of the ways that you can do that is to start talking about, instead of why are Black students underperforming in our Gateway courses, what causes certain courses to underperform for Black students? Why are faculty more likely to establish relationships with white students? Why are we more likely to provide hang-in practices for white students? What can we do to establish better relationships with Black or Latino students? So the goal here is to get away from seeing students as the cause of the problem and to start owning our own responsibility for the problems that they're facing in education. A lot of this you can see in the language that we use, in the way that we talk about students and we talk about their success. So just the term achievement gap is value laden. When we talk about students who are disadvantaged, right? That's a deficit mindset that we have about students that is not acknowledging the rich diversity of experience and the rich set of assets that they bring with us by the very nature of the fact that they have made it to Owens Community College. They have vast resources at their disposal. They may not be the kinds of resources that we traditionally value in education. They may not have come from very high performing schools. Their families may look different than what we assume to be middle-class white values, the sort of more valuable system for supporting student success. None of that is necessarily accurate. And the language that we use is a really important way that we can start unpacking those misperceptions and those assumptions. Very often, I have conversations with very well-meaning faculty when we're talking about building more flexibility into their courses, and they are really concerned about students, quote-unquote, taking advantage of flexibility, or it being unfair to students who turn everything on time to allow some students to turn in things late, not understanding the unfairness of the system that makes it such that some students have really uncomplicated lives and can do all of that work easily, whereas other students really struggle to even attend class every day. I also have a real issue sometimes when we talk about students using labels like good, right? Well, I don't want to penalize the good students by providing flexibility to those who can't work in on time. That is an incredibly value-laden statement. We are assigning moral value to our students based on whether they turn their assignments in on time. And whether they turn their assignments in on time has absolutely nothing to do with their moral integrity or the assets that they bring with them. And so we need to start critically interrogating all of this. And finally, for every practice or policy that is under consideration, ask yourself the questions we asked earlier about whether these practices were equitable or inequitable. Who by race and ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or first-generation status is going to benefit most from the policy or practice under consideration? And in what ways is this policy or practice going to disadvantage those who have been historically underserved by college, by higher education? Finally, I'm going to ask you all to think about not just building communities of practice where you come together to engage in dialogue and to build experiences for students that are equitable, but to think about what you're doing as building what Kazar and Gerke call communities of transformation. Our goal here really needs to be to transform the system if we're really going to achieve equity. And we need to empower communities of people all across our campuses to do this work, to organize around the real issues that we see in our data, to provide support for all of us learning, being uncomfortable, saying the wrong thing, trying things that aren't going to work without penalty, to build structures that are going to support the kinds of change that we know we need to make. So remember, to affect real change, we need to focus on the policies and practices, not the people. We need to focus on the impact. We need to look at our data, and we need to focus on evidence-based practices to design these anti-racist systems. I'm going to ask you to move now into the fourth and final breakout session. I want you first to spend a minute or two in silent reflection thinking about your role, your particular role, what you do at Owens, and the call that I've just made for us to be thinking about redesigning the system in communities of transformation. I want you to identify one concrete action that you commit to taking today to help design a system of education at Owens that will lead to equity of outcomes. I want you to identify what the first step will be. What is the action you commit to taking? What's the next step? So a couple of minutes to reflect, and then 5 minutes for small group share, and we'll do a few minutes of large group share out.
Moderators, I just want to move into your group. Julie, I'll move you to group 5.
I'll take group 2.
I'll do group 1 again.
I'll try to go to 8 again.
Denise, there was a question in the chat about helping others understand the issue. And I think that was related to when you were talking about attending to the language.
Yeah, it was my question, Erica. I was going to ask how you help others understand that when you say things like, I can't take something late because I didn't allow it for somebody else, how do you help them understand that, like, everyone has different circumstances? Like, what type of language and stuff you use?
Yeah, you know, I tend to talk about the bigger system, right? I tend to talk about the fact that our students are the product of a society and a system of education that does not treat them fairly. And that, you know, by the nature of these circumstances, some students, you know, end up having many more challenges, and that it's wonderful that some students do not require the benefit of additional flexibility. But if our goal is to help every student learn the material and to be successful, then flexibility is one of the tools in our toolkit. The other thing that I often say to faculty, this is an issue we're more concerned about than students. If you poll the average group of students and ask them, how much do you care that, some students get an extra day on an assignment if they need it and you don't? They don't care, as long as they also will get the extra day on the assignment if they need it. They think that's fair, right? So
right. Oh, absolutely.
Right, like we're using as an excuse, well, it's not fair to students, without actually privileging the student voice here and asking students, is that true? It's not true. Students understand that life is complicated sometimes. They want instructors to be flexible. In fact, every survey that I have seen in the last 6 months has at the top of the list of what students are screening for as we move through the pandemic. Instructors need to be flexible. They need to understand that our lives are complicated. And, and I think that, helping instructors to understand this may be more us than it's their students, sometimes is powerful as well. Does that help?
Yes,
help?
actually, that really, really does. I'm a faculty member, but I also work as sort of like a chair in the department. And so I struggle sometimes helping others see that, like, things aren't necessarily always fair for everyone. Like, if fair is a word that's really hard to, for me, it's hard to quantify. I have a son who has autism, and so it's hard for me to be like, well, it's fair, everything. That's really hard for me. So it's hard to and I just didn't know how to help navigate and see that you can't use the same recipe for everyone. Not everyone's going to is given all the same. We're not all on the same playing field. Not everyone gets everything the same way, and so you have to help adjust.
Right. And I think that one of the other things, so, I often get instructors who say to me, well, part of my job is, to prepare them for the real world, right? And in the real world, you have to be able to turn things in on time. And I sort of look at them and I say, oh, interesting. So you were never late on, getting a manuscript in. You never had to ask for an extension on, the program review you needed to send to the, to your project. That's the real world, right? The real world is that we get things done on time all the time.
Right, and we show up late to appointments.
Right. Yes. Right. Yes. And so, so if that is our goal, I call into question the fact that this is preparing them for the real world. If our goal, and most instructors will say that my goal is to help students learn this material and help them access, right, the career that they want to access. If you are creating unnecessary barriers in their way, then that is not helping, right? And so right. The primary goal is fairness, defined as every student is treated the same way, then okay, right? But most instructors, that's not their goal. It's hard for them to get past that mindset that, frankly, I think we are responsible for, right? That the educational system and our culture in general, we believe that we have created an equitable system that is a meritocracy. And that makes us all the more resistant to, creating or providing flexibility, because we don't want to believe it's necessary. Because once we believe it's necessary, we have to start unpacking why.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's so helpful. I know you have the rest of your presentation and you're watching your time. If you're able to squeeze any of that in when we all come back, that would be super helpful, I think.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, sorry to put you on the spot like that, but I think the hardest thing is how do we help others understand, for people who understand the idea? Because I hear that a lot, and I know other instructors do. And when I type that in the questions, someone else typed, yes, I second that. How do we help others understand?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if we don't get to it in the discussion for the last few minutes, I'll write something up and just share it out with you all.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I know that that's a real issue. So I think we should be about ready to pull people back, right?
Okay, absolutely. I'll move everyone back.
Pull them back.
Moving back. Moving on back.
My own class, I'm thinking about the department as a whole.
Thanks.
Yep, we're done.
Yep, we're done.
We're back in the large group. I hope you had an interesting, if probably too brief, conversation about this. And I am going to ask both to put in the chat, but also for a couple of people to share. What is an action that you commit to taking, and what's the first step? If anyone wants to raise their hand to volunteer, it'd be great to hear some new voices. But please also feel free to put what you're thinking in the chat function. Okay, so in the chat we have thinking about assigning more diverse readings, dealing specifically with issues of discrimination and oppression, committing to encouraging, saying something encouraging to every student you meet with. What are some other things, concrete actions, that you commit to taking to help design this more equitable system of education? Never ever tell a student they can't do something. Yes, language matters. So one of the things that I was sort of asked in the breakout to address, a couple of people in the chat feature before we went to break had asked, how do we help people to understand what fairness actually is, right? For those who say, I can't give you an extension on this assignment because it's not fair to other students. I get this a lot. I'm guessing you all do too. And I will say that there are different approaches that I often take, but it's usually multi-pronged. And number one is that I try to locate this in the larger system. So I talk about the fact that students are coming to our classroom with very different lived experiences and with different barriers that have been put in the way of their success. And so if what we're trying to accomplish is helping every student to succeed, then providing reasonable flexibility, as long as you're providing it for all students, is absolutely fair. The other thing that I often say to instructors is that this issue of fairness is often much more our issue than students. So if you ask students whether they perceive it to be unfair that an instructor would give a student an extension on a due date when they needed it, they say, no, that's not unfair, that is fair, as long as it's available to all students. And so I think that this is one of the consequences of the system of higher education that we are in, that assumes itself to be a meritocracy where everybody is equally able to succeed. The reality is incredibly far from that, as we have seen this morning. And unless we acknowledge that, we are going to do damage to our students and frankly do damage to the system of higher education in our society by not providing reasonable flexibility for students to be successful. So a couple of other things that I'm seeing in the chat is, stressing that we're all at different places in our journey and that that's okay. Contacting students prior to the first class, letting them know that their texts are not yet available, and we'll discuss what we will do so everyone can access them. All of these things can be incredibly important, absolutely. So we are about out of time. I think that maybe we have a minute or so if you have any additional questions that this workshop has raised for you or that remain unanswered. I would also like to encourage you, if you have questions, if you would like more information or resources, to please reach out to me. You have my contact information here. If you want to learn a little bit more about my perspective and my approach to this, there is a hyperlink at the top of this slide to a recent op-ed that I wrote for the Student Experience Project about becoming anti-racist institutions. So with that, I will open it up to a question or two and then turn it back over for you to complete your evaluation and apparently do a raffle so that you can win a prize for participating this morning. And I also just want to say thank you so much for all of you who participated. I appreciate the time. I know how busy you all are right now, and I hope that this was helpful to you in starting the kinds of conversations that I think you want to start on your campus. So are there any questions that you have for me at this point? Feel free to raise your hand. Yes, there will be a PDF available of all of these slides, as well as a resource list with some additional reading, additional resources. The link is not active. Okay, it should be in the PDF version that I provided to Erica. So if she can get all of that to you, then you should be able to access it. But if not, let me know, Erica, and I'll create a different version of it. All right, well, if there are no additional questions, again, thank you very much. If you would like to continue the conversation with me, please reach out. My email is at the bottom of the slide, and thank you again.
I would like to again thank Denise for presenting today. It was very useful, I think, information as we all start the semester. I know I took a bunch of notes for my syllabus to make a few changes before I send it out to students. So again, thank you.